Hello and welcome. I am Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Easynomics. Policy paralysis and economic uncertainty were the buzzwords used to describe the previous government of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, especially in its last years in power prior to 2014. After the Bharatiya Janata Party came to power in 2014, the Modi government promised that economic uncertainty would be a thing of the past. And as Prime Minister Modi nears 10 years in power next year, how has his government fared on this front? Joining me to answer this question that I am posing in the backdrop of a new report on this subject is Shubhada Rao, the founder of QuantEco Research. Also with us is her colleague Vivek Kumar, who is an economist at the firm. Welcome to the show. Shubhada, before we sort of get into the nitty-gritty of this, the headline obviously in news terms is economic uncertainty has reduced. Give us the key takeaway as to how did you come to this conclusion and what is the data that you are basing this observation on?
Thank you, Siddharth, at the outset for having us on the show. These issues that you raised earlier on are very pertinent, particularly when the world is grappling with a huge amount of volatility and uncertainty. And therefore, it becomes critical to evaluate what could be the policy environment for any government to thrive in. I would think that a lot of it also depends on the nature of the government formation. If it is a multi-party coalition kind of a formation, many a times there are time delays and unanimity delays for coming towards any concrete policy decision outcomes. Whereas if there is a strong one party strong government, I think that cuts short the time delays, that brings in more unanimity. Of course, there would be debates, but the unanimity probability is significantly higher compared to a multi-party coalition set of governments. So I think this is what is the backdrop. But more importantly, we had come across this policyuncertainty.com, which incidentally is also used by the IMF, the data points from there. What they do create is a global uncertainty index, which essentially sources their data and methodologies based on three parameters. One is, of course, a set of many newspaper articles having words like monetary policy, fiscal policy, deficits, legislations, taxes, regulation, etc. Keywords for economic policy making, no two ways about it. Also, they have two other parameters for many of the developed nations, like the tax code and survey of professional forecasters. In recent times, what we did come across in that methodology, which has been created incidentally by Baker, Bloom, and Davis, belonging to Kellogg, Stanford, and Chicago Booth, all well-reputed institutions. It's a methodology created by them, and they have come across countrywide, across globe, across countries, the indices for policy uncertainty stroke certainty. So we thought it becomes a very interesting exercise to plot global uncertainty index versus India's policy uncertainty index, and more importantly, just see the period between, say, 2012 to 2022 as to what has been the policy environment. And we choose the period carefully because 2012, 2013 was the taper tantrum, and a lot of policy uncertainty factors were erupting in the marketplace, global monetary policy, fiscal policy, etc., and the financial markets. So that's why we chose the period 2012 to 2022. And for India, of course, the methodology in recent times has been based purely on newspaper articles on the subject that I mentioned, various subjects. But the authors do clarify that it does not dilute the outcomes of the index
Okay.
creation for all the countries. So I'll just cut it short here, but it was based on a very interesting thought that we need to evaluate globally what has been the policy environment across the countries and aggregating it across for the globe in total.
Vivek, I'm coming to you. So if India has reduced policy uncertainty, That's also come at a time when this report also reflects the fact that from 2015 we saw protectionism, 5 years later we saw the pandemic and then the Ukraine war. Would you therefore say that things like GST or demonetization or some of the radical economic reforms that the Modi government undertook actually contributed to uncertainty, because some of those steps were also criticized for being sudden or just too big in their impact?
Thanks, Siddharth. I think you've hit the nail on the head. In fact, I'll take a step back and take you all the way back to 2014. That was the time when the central bank in India went forward and embraced the inflation targeting framework. That was a new experiment for us, and we did that for the first time. Before that, central banking in India was, you could say that it was bordering on the lines of being somewhat ad hoc, because at times we used to look at WPI inflation, at times we used to look at CPI inflation, sometimes we used to look at core inflation. So there were a host of variables that the central bank used to look at, and policy was framed thereafter. From 2014 onwards, at least the central banking in India has now become much more predictable. You now have a set of rules that govern the Monetary Policy Committee, and they are answerable to the rule which is prescribed by the Parliament in terms of both maintaining price stability as well as maintaining exchange rate stability as well as preserving the overall growth momentum is concerned. So thereafter, I think the government took the seminal reform of auctioning natural resources, whether it is in the form of spectrum, whether it is in the form of mines which were auctioned thereafter. So rules-based policy making, I would say, to some extent, started displacing, somewhat of an ad hoc approach towards policy making, which was earlier in place, and system and processes and institutional policy making much more organized. It has got much more organized since then. GST is a fabulous example of what you mentioned, and I think last but not the least, the experience with the pandemic has been there for all of us to see. So it's not that India did not suffer from the pandemic. Everybody in the world suffered. We also see a fairly significant amount of contraction in our GDP. Having said so, we have not really burnt our fiscal weapon, or not really exhausted our fiscal weapon in terms of fighting the COVID battle. Also, we used COVID as an opportunity to push through some of the structural reforms. So if you see, India has emerged relatively strongly from the COVID as far as the fiscal balance sheet is concerned. As far as the overall dent on the economic growth is concerned, if you look at the 3-year period, then India would have suffered one of the least in the COVID post-COVID phase. Rather than, if you were to just look at the post-2020, 2021, India probably would stand out as one of the most severely affected countries. But look at the 3-year performance put together, then I think there is a fair bit of comfort to be drawn in terms of what the policy making has been and how the overall thrust has been in terms of durable growth drivers, especially on the capex side. So government has very
Right.
cleverly used this platform to push through their capex agenda, and
Right.
rightfully so, because the private sector was almost limping, and government was in shape, in position to push through the growth lever at that point in time.
Shubhda, I am reminded of what happened when it came to tax policy, for example, prior to 2014, and how that became one of the biggest problems as far as India's reputation as investment destination and for sentiment. That is now a thing of the past. But we must also recall the fact that in 2014, when the Modi government came, the first major ordinance that it came up with was for land reforms, and which was held in abeyance. The comparison that I am trying to draw out from you is this uncertainty the central theme and headline on account of the fact that decision making is more centralized and there is greater coordination at the level of the government? For example, there are very few GOMs, and pre-2014 I had once counted there were close to 60 GOMs on various different subjects, Shubhda.
So I would like to highlight two things here, Siddharth. One is, of course, that when I spoke about India having decoupled from the heightened uncertainty, and India presents itself with a more policy certainty environment, which is good for an economy. Very quickly, we would like to, we've shared some of these graphics with you. One of them brings out that the long-term relationship between lower the uncertainty, better the GDP growth potential. And if you don't need to look at year to year, but if you do it at a 3-year moving average, clearly there is a 70% greater probability of improving your country's potential growth if there is less uncertainty. And from that perspective, India is doing exceptionally well, as Vivek, amplified very comprehensively on different policy measures that the current government has taken. Now, the point of issues that you spoke about in terms of taxation and so on. Now, there are some reforms which also, need concurrence of across states, and particularly when I talk of there are land and labor come to mind, that these need all states also coming on board along with center. And unfortunately, we've had a little bit of a back and forth on a couple of these policies, but the certain number of policies which center could push and execute in terms of reformist policies, I think India has done very well. And what Vivek actually alluded to earlier, I think post COVID, probably India would stand out, in not being a fiscally profligate economy or a government which actually sort of consolidated and conserved its resources to be able to use judiciously when the time arose. So, in that perspective or in that context, the reason why we bring out is this last 10 years have been particularly positive in terms of not just creating a better environment for business and growth, bringing overseas investors here. That actually has gotten even better post COVID and post Russia Ukraine war, because the China Plus theme has actually very concretely taken shape and root. And India is actually every single day getting more and more global giants in businesses and services actually coming to India and setting up a new shop or extending the current shop. So that what we're trying to say is policy environment needs to be very, very durable, uh, uh, predictable, and long lasting, if you want to look at countries growth potential to set at a higher level. So that's our simple message when we presented our research.
Vivek, one of the slides, and this is the cross-country picture, which shows that India has gained the most over a 10-year period from 2012 to 2022. I'm just surprised the fact that Germany is number one, followed by Russia, followed by Chile and China and Ireland and Singapore and Korea, Brazil, France. Those are among the top 10 countries. Explain this to us, because on the other hand, India has made the most gains, followed by Greece, which was a basket case economy for quite some time that I would recall, and Netherlands and countries like Spain and Japan.
Sure. I think Greece is fairly easy to explain because the choice of comparison starts from 2012 or 2013 onwards, and that was like the bottom phase for Greece. Since then, Greece, with the help of European Union and the IMF and the World Bank, so they have actually been on an uphill. So actually, the point of comparison makes a difference here. That is why Greece is standing out in terms of the green or the gains in the policy making environment. Now, what is surprising is like some of the developed countries like Germany, Ireland, Singapore, and in fact some of the newly industrialized nations like Korea and Singapore are there on the other side of the fence, which is that policy uncertainty has increased. And so is the case in case of China and Russia. So these are important emerging market economies. Now, what we guess is that the environment post 2015 and 2016 onwards, from a global trade perspective, became slightly hostile. And this was with respect to the change of policy making in the US. This took a much more hostile turn towards some of the Asian countries, especially China, in terms of trade, bilateral trade. And this had its spillover impact with respect to China, with respect to some of the other emerging economies where there are global value chains which are linked to each other. So it is not surprising that the protectionism which kind of started in 2015 has had a very adverse impact on some of the countries which are extremely export linked. So if you pick up Korea, if you pick up Singapore, if you pick up China, in fact even Germany. So these are nations, these are economies which have a fairly high degree of export to GDP ratio. So this is one message which I draw from them. The other is the fact that China also suffered from a very unique set of real estate pain, which the country is actually still undergoing to some extent. And obviously, last but not the least, is the COVID experience that China had. In fact, China was one of the last major countries to come out of COVID, as late as I think 5 months back. So all this kind of explains why some of these important industrialized nations have at least appear to have suffered much more in terms of policy making uncertainty vis-a-vis India.
Vivek, quick follow up on that, and I wonder if you were to overlay another line graph on top of what you have given in the data, which is FDI inflows. And the reason I ask you this is because one of the other points in your report is policy predictability being good for long term investment. Offhand, would you be able to connect FDI inflows and policy certainty?
Definitely. I think if you look at how the FDI flows have in dollar terms, they've kind of upscaled from anywhere between around 20, $25 billion 10 year ago to somewhere close to 40, $45 billion, that being the run rate on an average basis. So there has been, I would say, if not 15 billion, then maybe in fact more, 15 to 20 billion dollars of up movement on a trend basis if we have to compare 2022 vis-a-vis 2020, vis-a-vis 2012. So that has been the upscale in terms of FDI movement. And it's not just FDI, by the way, the entire gamut of capital flows. So if you put in portfolio flows, largely on the equity side, less so on the debt side, and also include flows coming in from the VCs. So venture capitalists over the last 3, 4, 5 years, especially in the startup space, have been very actively involved in deal making in terms of Indian companies. So I would see it from the perspective of direct investment flows, from the perspective of portfolio equity flows, and from the perspective of venture capital funding that India has been receiving in the last few years.
Shubhda, if we sort of step beyond the 10-year time period which we've been discussing and go back to when reforms started and from then to now, would it be right to pose the question that does this also represent the fact that India is now finally maturing as an economic destination? The first 10-15 years of reforms, experimentation, also significant political opposition, trade union activism, coalition governments, frequent changes, and then the Vajpayee years, which saw a certain kind of growth impetus. From then to now, how would you compare the sort of growth of our country as a policy destination, as an investment destination?
I would think that India is doing exceptionally well when it comes to the very recent period, particularly from the point of view of the diversity in the set of reforms that India has undertaken. It comes quite akin to what we were compelled to do post 1991, where you had every sphere of the macroeconomy being reviewed and evaluated and initiated with a set of reforms. I think that period to now, what we are in recent times seeing is all spheres, be it in taxation, we can do better in taxation, but at least we have begun creating an ecosystem very conducive for investment, for entrepreneurship, You look at and when I talk of taxation, I'm talking of GST as well. Talk of what Vivek earlier alluded to. As a macroeconomist, one would worry about the inflation scenarios and inflation regime, and that, to my mind, has succeeded very well in anchoring inflation expectations. The short point I would like to make, Siddharth, here is it's very important that there is a much more broad based approach that any government should adopt in creating your economy, your country, as one of the most attractive destinations for investments. India, with a 1.4 billion people, by definition becomes a very attractive destination. But if you do not combine it with a very conducive ecosystem laced with all kinds of reforms, all spheres of reform making areas, then it just becomes an advantage on paper. What we have seen in recent times is a very dramatic shift in sentiment. And I would like to add here that, Siddharth, I think what the geopolitical situation has evolved over the last 3 years has only made India even more attractive in terms of having more stability, more predictability, and I think that goes well long term in its ability to be able to attract more and more durable investment in the country.
A quick final question, Shubhda, to you first. What remains to be done, and work that is sort of in progress or incomplete as far as ensuring that we are the best investment destination in the world?
I think there is a little bit more on taxation that we can work on. Like GST, we are trying to move towards fewer number of rates and more simplified. Of course, compliance is getting better with each year. We could cover that even more so. Land labor continue to remain in an area or a zone of absence of unanimity. I think we need to work on that, because any direct investment, capex creation, would need these two, factors of production becoming more and more efficient, which is basically land and labor. I think it's not that India has done it all and we now just sit pretty. I think there's a lot of work going ahead, which is needed to be done. India's aspirational growth would always be in the vicinity of 7 to 8% in the new environment post-COVID. But to be able to walk that path and actualize that kind of aspirational growth, we would need to have all the reforms getting executed, broad-based unanimity being arrived at. I think all these become important ingredients to actually realize the true potential of the Indian economy.
All right, Shubhda, thank you very much for sharing those insights with us. Vivek, thank you too for your time with us. Clearly, as we evaluate the last 10 years of the Modi government, your findings also provide us a certain sense of vindication on what a lot of people in industry have said, but like you said, there is much more work to be done. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of Easynomics. I'll be back with more. Do stay tuned in, and until then, do like, share and subscribe Business Today Television. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.